Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today, I'm going to be talking about two biases that influence the way we look at and interpret data: confirmation bias and self-serving bias. Neither are particularly helpful, to be honest, but I'm going to share some ways that you can minimise the impact of these two biases and strategies to help you identify when they might be at play. One of the examples that I use in the book, I'm Not a Numbers Person, to, highlight the challenges and the issues with some of these biases is the one where I talk about an executive leader who asked me to review their performance in 10 key performance indicators. This leader's goal and aspiration was that the company should be improving on these 10 indicators every year. And he just had his, annual review, and he had the annual metrics, and he was able to kind of look at how they had gone, in the previous 12-month period, as opposed to how they had performed in previous years. It was really interesting because he spoke to me and he said, look, Selena, his words were, I'm going to put a rocket up my staff tomorrow. And he said, because I've just got this data, I've got these 10 KPIs and it's terrible. It's really not good. They've really underperformed. The company's not going all that well. They need motivation. I need to really share this with them. I need to have really difficult conversations. This is a tricky conversation to have with them because things are so bad. Can you please just check to see whether I'm right and whether I haven't missed anything? And I was like, yeah, of course, I'm really happy to do that. I obviously know him. I don't work in his organization. I never have. But as an outsider, I guess I just was able to provide a bit more of an objective view. And I looked at the data, and what I could see in it was that his goal was to improve in all 10 KPIs. His team had actually done that in 6 out of 10. So straight away, I thought, okay, this is not really matching up with what he's told me and that things are really bad. They've improved in 6 out of 10, and I thought, okay, well, let's look at the size of improvement. And I could see that they had quite significantly improved in those 6 out of 10. So I was like, okay, well, that's good. What's happening for those 4 that are obviously not as good? I then went into those 4 and I realized that, they had gone backwards in some ways. It's not the best language, but they were lower than they had been 12 months prior. And then I looked at them and I recognized, because again, I thought about size, and I thought, well, actually, these metrics are all very, very similar to what they were 12 months ago. Yes, it looks bad and it's being highlighted as red because they're lower, but they're very minimally lower. They're not hugely different to where they were 12 months ago. So I had to go back to him and say, look, mate, I actually don't think that putting a rocket up them, as you said, is the best strategy. Like, there've actually been some really good growth and improvement in 6 out of the 10 metrics. The 4 that haven't seen growth have actually not been terrible, and they're not hugely different. And so it was an important conversation, and it actually really changed the way that he then went into that meeting the following day, and he completely changed the approach that he had with his staff. And I said, look, I actually think that you really need to celebrate the 6 out of 10 things that are better and significantly better than what they were. We'd had a conversation about statistical significance. And for me, I often use a metric of 5% change. In research, we know a p-value of 0.05 is an indication of significance. And in the real world, that means that if something changes more or less than 5%, we can deem it to be significant or not. And that's a pretty useful metric to use across the board. And so we talked about that. And I said, look, to be honest, the things that are lower this year, it's not statistically significant because it's within 1 or 2% of what those metrics were 12 months ago. So it's not a significant change. So we talked about that, and it really changed the way that he approached those conversations. This story for me really highlights 2 of these biases that we're going to be talking about in this episode today, both confirmation bias and self-serving bias. For him, this is an example of confirmation bias because what we know about that is we fall into the trap of confirmation bias where we seek out or we latch onto the evidence or the data that we have that confirms something that we already believed. It confirms an expectation, a hypothesis that we have, and we kind of latch onto that stuff. And what it means is that we actually end up being quite blinded to the other really good information in this case. He couldn't see the success that they'd had because he went into the analysis thinking, yeah, look, things haven't actually been going all that well. I'm not really happy with the performance of my team. I feel like things have potentially gone backwards. Things are not better than they were 12 months ago. And so when he did that analysis, he latched onto and jumped onto those pieces that were negative and just didn't have the time and space to actually think slowly and deliberately about the size of the change, the number of things that had actually improved versus not improved. And he wasn't going to present that data in a way that was really balanced because he was latching onto that confirmation of the hypothesis and the perception that he already had. Confirmation bias plays out in both ways. So if he'd gone into this analysis thinking, my team's great and they're making great gains and there's been some real improvements, he would have had the completely opposite interpretation of the results. He would have focused just on the 6. He would have talked about maybe how significant the improvement had been. And it might have even meant that when he went back to staff, he didn't even talk about the 4 that weren't as good as the other ones. So it's problematic both ways. It can latch on. We can latch onto things that are better. We can latch onto things that are worse. But whatever way, it's something that kind of confirms or is similar to the perception, the belief that we already had going into the analysis. Confirmation bias can also play out when people latch onto or focus on one particular metric. And this goes back to that point that I made in the episode about triangulation. If one piece of data is confirming the belief that you already have, that might be lovely, but it's important to make sure that we then go back and say, okay, well, what other data do we have? What other information do we have about this particular phenomenon? And is it telling me the same picture, and is it creating kind of the same narrative for me about success or lack of success as that first piece? The problem with confirmation bias in the triangulation work is that often it will stop people's thinking after that first data set and they won't seek out additional information because it's almost like you're seeing and you have evidence of the thing that you inherently believed. So we need to always make sure that we're thinking about, well, what is that second piece of data? What's that third piece of data? And is it telling me the same picture? We don't want to shut down that thinking and stop it. For example, like if a manufacturing company is looking at growth and expansion and that's kind of their priority for the quarter and they can start to see that their sales have increased, that could be awesome confirmation that things are heading in the right direction. But what we also know is that if they looked at other data and found out that their expenses are up, their delivery times increase, like customer satisfaction might have dropped and customers are not as happy anymore, confirmation bias could really just lead them to focusing on the overall sale improvement and disregarding those other things that are actually equally important and are going to contribute to growth and expansion over time. The second bias that was influencing the CEO's interpretation of his KPIs is self-serving bias. It's another cognitive bias that absolutely can influence our work with data. Generally, what it means when we are, subject to self-serving bias, it means that we tend to see positive results as a reflection of us and the efforts and, all the effort that we've put in. But when things don't go well, we start to blame those poor results on other external factors or other people. So it's almost like we internalize and reflect positively internally on the good data, and then we blame others. Hence the language that this guy used around, I want to put a rocket up them. He didn't look at the negative data and the things where it wasn't as good as what it might have been or could have been. He didn't think about what that meant for him and how that reflected on him as a leader. It was immediately, okay, I'm going to go and talk to these people about it because they've got to fix it. The flip side to this story for self-serving bias could have been if he'd looked at these 10 KPIs and 6 are better and they're significantly better. Self-serving bias would have been that if he had the hunch that things were improving and he focused on the 6 really good news stories, self-serving bias would have meant that he would have attributed those improvements to the role he's played as a leader. So there would have been real connection to him thinking about and possibly promoting, like, look at what I've been able to do with my team, look at all the growth that we've experienced while I've been at the helm. And so that self-serving, nature of that reflection and the confirmation of the good news stories in self-serving bias, it's that we forget that actually other people absolutely contributed to those metrics being different. It's true that he might be a leader doing an amazing job and he's leading a team to change, and he's also not the only person. And unfortunately, self-serving bias sometimes means that we forget that and we don't highlight or celebrate the contribution of other people enough. So how do we minimize the impact of some of these biases? I was about to say prevent them, but we can't ever truly prevent them. They're always going to be there, but we can be aware of them, and awareness is a really important part of reducing the impact. But we also need to have strategies in place when we're looking at our data and we're doing our own investigations and analysis and thinking about what those trends and insights are. Because if we're not aware, if we don't have strategies, then we are likely to fall into this trap of both confirmation bias and self-serving bias. One of the things that Adam Grant talks about in his book, Think Again, and I always refer to this, is the idea of having a hypothesis and thinking like a scientist. Scientists have hypotheses and they seek out data that proves that hypothesis, which is, in a way, what this CEO had done. He had a hypothesis that things were not going all that well, and he looked for data that proved that, and that was kind of confirmation bias. But the difference between scientists and this CEO's, approach was that scientists not only look for data that proves the hypothesis that they have, they also actively seek out and look for data that disproves the hypothesis. So if this CEO had been able to be a little bit more measured in his analysis and think, okay, I've latched onto these 4 metrics that are not as good, and they're confirming that things are not going all that well. If he'd been able to stop and pause there and go, actually, what's the data that disproves that? I think things are not going all that well, but what data do I have that might be telling me that things are going well? If he'd done that well, he would have actually been able to say, well, hang on, there's 6 things here that are actually pretty good and great and have got some really great growth, and we've only got 4 things that aren't. So he would have actually gone in with a more balanced perception, even if he did want to focus on the 4, maybe more, which is not particularly useful. But maybe even if he focused on the 4, he could have done some more balanced reporting. He could have said, okay, well, there's 4 that are not great and we want to talk about those, but there are 6 that really are worth celebrating. And so hypothesis testing and that idea of thinking like a scientist that Adam Grant talks about is that we're looking for the data that actively disproves the hypothesis that we have as well. And in doing that, sometimes we can kind of see that actually maybe the hypothesis we had in the beginning wasn't actually as accurate as we thought it was. And we can maybe start to break that cycle of confirmation bias. I also think about that through the lens of Daniel Kahneman's work from his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking. And system 1 thinking is that fast, automatic thinking where we don't spend a whole lot of time actually engaging cognitively with the questions that we have, whereas system 2 thinking is slower and more deliberate, and we're able to see different perspectives. System 1 thinking, Kahneman's research indicates that we use System 1 thinking about 98% of the time. So that's that really fast thinking that we're not really engaging with deeply. And that's not the dream. If we're talking about analysis and leading people and having conversations with them about their performance and their growth, we don't want to be, and we shouldn't be, spending time just thinking in a System 1 frame of thinking. We absolutely need to be tapping into more slow and deliberate thinking. And, that hypothesis testing and looking for data that disproves a hypothesis is a way of slowing down our brains and being a bit more discerning and considering different perspectives. One of the other strategies that I would encourage you, if you're worried about the impact of either of these biases or any of the other ones that we have, is to have more people view the data and have conversations about it. So one of the things that this CEO could have done was, instead of going in telling them what he thought and what he saw, he could have actually gone in with the data set and had a conversation about, this is where we were, this is where we are now, what are some of the things that you're taking from this, what are some of the trends? And what might have happened was that people in the room could have gone, hey, well, actually, we've done really well in these 6 categories out of 10. And then that would have been a really different conversation rather than him kind of going in with this biased interpretation of the values. And who knows what damage that could have done if he'd done it. The other way is potentially just if you are going to present the data and you want to present a summary, it's just having an outsider or somebody who's more objective to look at that data and just confirm with them or just check with them the things that they see. So he did that. To his credit, he did that. He reached out to me and said, can you just check that I've not missed anything? And that checking, that almost fact checking with an outsider was really useful, because when I shared with him what I had seen, he was like, oh gosh, like I missed that completely. I would have told them a really different story the following day. It would have been very, very different messaging had we not had this conversation. So while I don't understand his context, as I say, I've never worked in it, just kind of almost fact checking with somebody who is more objective, maybe an outsider, maybe somebody in a different team. It can be a really useful way of just checking that we're not falling into that trap of confirmation bias or self-serving bias. So that brings us to the end of this little episode on confirmation and self-serving bias. I hope that's given you some strategies and ways to potentially minimize some of that impact. As I said, knowing that those two things play into any analysis that we do is a really good start and way of thinking about it. We've got to absolutely be flagging that these things are issues, and we've got to be minimizing the impact wherever we possibly can. Some of the ways that you can connect with me, if you'd like to know a little bit more, is that I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach out at Dr. Selena Fisk. I also have a very irregular, roughly about monthly newsletter that you can sign up to on my website. So that's at selenafisk.com, and there's a banner at the top, and you can sign up if you'd like a few more gems about data and data storytelling in general. So thanks so much for joining us as always, and stay safe and look after yourself.